I know that a few of the factions we've spoken about so far in Third Age Reforged have got a somewhat limited picture within the lore that we can talk about, but perhaps none more so than KHAND. Many of the kingdoms of men as you go further east are shrouded in a little bit more mystery, and KHAND is the furthest east, and so there is the least recorded about them within Tolkien's works that we can actually draw from in terms of what they are, and indeed there is a little bit of doubt regarding their own allegiances to Sauron, with the fact that the Blue Wizards did head east long ago to try and disrupt Sauron's influence in these further eastern lands, but for the most part KHAND are still considered to be one of Sauron's vassal states within the game, and that is how they are by default, but in perhaps the same way as you could say that Rhudaur do have some rather tenuous links back to their good aligned past, and there are some, there's a bit of back and forth when it comes to the Númenóreans as well. KHAND perhaps fall a little bit more in line with that, rather than the outright evil kingdoms around them that you could say that Rhûn in particular are, with their allegiances to dragons and the like. But we will talk about what KHAND are good at, mostly in terms of a military perspective first and foremost. And the first thing to note here really is the fact that they have very, very good horse archers. They are one of two factions in the game where you can deploy an overwhelming number of horse archers, the other of course being Rohan, but KHAND are maybe a little bit better in this regard, in this sort of mass horse archer regard, purely because they've got a little bit more of a focus around survivability. Rohan at the high end are maybe a little bit better at dealing damage with some of their better horse archers and with some of their better cavalry in general, but KHAND, they have got a little bit more margin for error, just because, especially when it comes to ranged units, generally speaking, trading back and forth, you want that little bit extra bulk in terms of armour and defensive values, and KHAND do have that. They also have a very good variety of horse archers in general. Some of them don't actually have particularly good survivability and a more damage focus, but it's about the variety of units that they have in this regard. And most factions, when it comes to, even if they are cavalry focused factions, may have access to one unit of horse archers, but KHAND and Rohan have got access to several, and it does give you that sort of swarm mentality, and in particular with KHAND as well, with some of their sort of stylistic choices, their links to the Mongols are very, very clear, and the horse archers being probably the thing they're most well known for more than anything else, shouldn't be too much of a surprise as a result of that. But also, to continue the cavalry theme, melee cavalry is what they tend to focus a little bit more on, both in terms of hybridized units. With some of the horse archers that we've already mentioned, in particular some of the higher tier ones, they tend to be very good as a melee cavalry unit as well, but also dedicated melee cavalry. This is where they do have a bit of a departure from Rohan, the faction that is easiest to compare them against, because Rohan have got a real focus on aggressive cavalry, generally speaking, lances and spears and the like, whereas KHAND do have more of a focus on melee cavalry, so really trying to get a stranglehold on having cavalry advantage, using their melee cavalry and horse archers, and then, sort of wearing the enemy down like that, whereas Rohan are a little bit more about trying to smash the enemy to pieces all in one go, and both, of course, have their merits. But again, I would say that the melee cavalry focus means that as KHAND, you're less likely to make any significant misplays which will result in, you having real trouble in getting your way back into a battle. But also, inversely, they lack a little bit of the killer blow that Rohan do have, because of the fact they have less of this lance cavalry available to them, albeit they do still have some, and when we go through the army composition on the grassy plain, I think it will be very clear to see some of the units at the high end in particular they have, which can fill that role, but it certainly isn't as widespread as it is for the Rohirrim. But like I said, that melee cavalry means that for the most part, very, very few factions in the game are going to want to tackle a full KHANDish cavalry force head-on with their own full cavalry approach, both in terms of numbers and because that melee cavalry is going to make it pretty damn difficult indeed. And the final thing to note as well is something which has always really been true of KHAND ever since they were added into the game. As much as they are a cavalry-centric faction, they do have a pretty solid infantry force, and there are some downsides to it, which we will speak about when we go through some of the weaknesses, but they're pretty good at weathering a storm. They do have a lot of armor-piercing units as well, so in particular against some of the Western Kingdoms, even though some of their units individually do have a few downsides, they can make up for that by the fact that they're not all that expensive. And you can add that bit of armor piercing as well to do that bit of extra damage. The armor values are not the best, but they're not terrible either. Also, several of their units, including their archers, come equipped with decent shield values, so wearing them down from afar is also going to be pretty difficult. It also means that they're going to be a little bit more resilient, generally speaking, in melee. Even units like their archers, which are generally not going to be thought of as frontline combatants initially, even late on in games they can be a little bit more difficult to finish off than you might be expecting, considering the kind of units that they are. And all of this does add up to mean that KHAND are a very difficult faction, or a more difficult faction than maybe you would think, to finish off even when you have them on the run. But that's not to say that they don't have some downsides, and the first thing to note is even though they do have good solid infantry forces and units to pick from, as I mentioned, the armour, the shields and also the combined arms effect that you can build with them is the main thing which gives them their defensive stability. They do have more limited melee defense on foot as a general rule. The Brotherhood units this doesn't really apply to, but they're more expensive, so you kind of get what you pay for in that regard. When it comes to the vast majority of your frontline infantry force, if you do get involved with a quality-centric faction, you can start to lose a bit of ground because of the lower melee defense, and of course it's also a consequence of having that slight armor-piercing focus that they do have, not too dissimilar to their neighbours in Rune, maybe a little bit less of an all-round identity to the faction, but it is still something that you do have to bear in mind when it comes to tackling enemy infantry forces, especially ones from really quality-centric forces like the elves, because you're going to struggle one-to-one certainly, and you're going to have to really try and leverage your numbers, which you can do as KHAND, as an evil men force, and not a particularly expensive one. You can field an awful lot of units, but this does come with a bit of a caveat. The second thing that I would mention is that cavalry-centric forces are very expensive to field. So if you do go for that approach as KHAND, you have to be aware of the fact that you are going to be curtailing yourself in certain other ways. It's kind of the same sort of thing where if you bring too many bodyguard units, the army size that you have is going to be far too small to be able to deal with a more well-balanced force. Full cavalry armies can work in the right situations, but there is a time and a place for it, and even a partial cavalry force, depending on the kind of units that you can bring, is very expensive. And as we've already mentioned, there are certain downsides to the KHANDish infantry force where if you take away too much of your resources from it, you can be damaging them even more. And it means that you're not going to have the numbers on foot or the quality potentially to be able to deal with it, and it really does put all of your eggs into the cavalry basket. That is the question that you have to pose yourself when you're building an army as KHAND, and like I said, really heavy cavalry armies can work, but there is a time and a place, and you also have to build correctly and play correctly with them as well. It's cavalry forces I think are far more about player skill perhaps than individual stats, which can be true with more skirmishy or more infantry focused armies. So again, that is the question that you have to ask yourself. And the final thing I would say, and again this is more of a potential problem with their infantry more so than their cavalry, is the fact that there are potential morale issues with KHAND as well. Again, as an evil men force, they do tend to have slightly lower morale than the equivalent Western kingdoms, and it's not as pronounced as it would be certainly with the Misty Mountains or some of the more entry-level Orcish units that you will see. But your infantry on the front line, if it does start to lose ground, mentally it can start to fall apart, and that solid front line of KHAND is an important part of most battles that you will see them in a siege, whether on the attack or the defence, of course. Your infantry is going to need to be able to stand up to units which are potentially going to be more potent than they are in terms of dealing damage. You're going to be reliant on numbers, and one of the ways that enemy forces can deal with more numbers heavy forces like this is to try and rout them. And like I said, KHAND, unlike forces like Rudauer who have slightly higher morale on average than evil men factions, there is no such luxury really when we're talking about the KHANDish forces. But this is much better explained, I think, when we go on to the grassy plain and start talking about their units on a one-to-one basis. And this is one I think we're going to have to divide things up into two parts, because it's a pretty big roster, and of course with the sheer amount of cavalry and armour upgrades that KHAND do have available to them, this is the first one in a while where we're going to have to divide between infantry and archers and then cavalry and the unique siege that KHAND have as well. So let's head over there right now. So yes, we are going to have to divide the roster when it comes to KHAND, although much of this is down to the heightened level of cavalry and also the upgrades associated with some of those cavalry units, because they have actually, in the grand scheme of things, lost a couple of units since the update did roll around, albeit the last time we did the KHAND-ish faction overview as well, they've actually gained a couple of units as well, so I think it's probably a sort of net nothing really in terms of the units that have come and gone, and I think the units they've had added to them are more significant than the ones they've lost. But we will get straight into things, and it actually starts off maybe a little bit differently than you would expect from many of the other evil forces that we have seen thus far, because the entry-level units they have are both shock infantry. They don't have an entry-level unit that has even a basic shield that's used as fodder in that way. In this way, in fact, KHAND are maybe most similar to the dwarves in the sense that the dwarves militia unit also only is a shock infantry, but KHAND do have access to the two flavours really of two-handers, and that is the first being the armour piercing. The nomadic axemen cost 500, you can't upgrade them, they are very numerous, but they are pretty much the quintessential entry-level evil shock unit really, in the sense that individually speaking they don't have the most defensive acumen, albeit they will be a little bit better than some of the entry-level orcish units of the same type. Certainly in terms of their staying power, that is their main weakness, because their armour is not particularly high, their defensive skill is quite low, and they don't have a shield either. There are enough of them to the point where if they do take a few stray hits and ultimately a few casualties as a result of that, it's not the end of the world. And also, for a unit of this cost, an attack of 10 that's armour piercing with this many of them, if you get them into the right engagement, they can be pretty efficient. And of course, if you do want to pad your army out with some numbers, this is going to be the way you're going to do it. It's just maybe not going to be quite so resilient and tough to break down as some other units of militia can be from the evil forces. KHAND do have that elsewhere in their infantry. In fact, elsewhere you would say it's their main focus of their infantry really. But here, maybe a little bit more damaging than you would be normally expecting. And the other option they have at the entry level are the Variag warriors, which when it comes to two-handed sword units, I think this might be the cheapest in the game. 450, obviously you get what you pay for to a certain extent, and there are certain downsides to the Variag warriors, and that mainly comes in their defensive stats, which is usually where heavy swordsmen are pretty domineering, but of course a cheaper one like this is going to be less so. Baseline armour of 6. The defensive skill of 8 is still good, however, for a unit that only costs 450 at the base. A little bit cheaper at the base than the nomadic axemen, but you can bring them up to the same cost if you do upgrade the armour, and I think the vast majority of the time I think this is what you're going to want to do, because it does slightly make up for a slight weakness that this unit has in relation to its peers. But the attack of 12 and the charge of 14 with this many numbers as well, it means that from a pure melee perspective, especially when you upgrade the armour like this, they are one of the most efficient cheap units that the game has to offer. But the lack of a shield does mean that, especially if you're marching them into a pretty hairy situation in a siege, for example, and they end up getting shot to bits, they aren't going to be able to withstand that quite so much as some of the other entry-level units from many of the other factions that the game has to offer. The bonus fighting cavalry is a nice little touch as well. It means that, again, you're really trying to secure that cavalry advantage for yourself. Even among your infantry units, you're going to have that little bit of a bite to you. They share that in common a little bit with Dunland, who also try to add a little bit of anti-cavalry into units which would normally maybe not have such a bonus. Charge bonus of 14 as well, but otherwise that's pretty much it. I mean, a fairly unique unit as far as an entry-level heavy sword unit goes that the game has, but yeah, the armour upgrade as well. Interesting that you can have that kind of feel to your more basic units. Moving on up, however, 600 for the Nurad footman. This is going to be your rank and file soldier on the front line, the standard line infantry that you have. 183, it means it's not quite as numerous as some of the line infantry units that some of the other evil forces have. It's a little bit more in line with what you would expect from Rune. They're not quite as good as the Flag Rim equivalent over there, but then you pay a little bit less. And also, the main selling point of the Nurad footmen is the fact they have a very big shield value of 10, those large rectangular wicker shields, able to protect them very well from arrow fire. But they also have the same weaknesses that this kind of infantry unit generally has, which is the base attack is lower. So only a base attack of 5 is, not the highest. It means that against units which are not so dependent on armour, they aren't going to be as efficient, but against equivalent units which do place a heavier emphasis on armour, this is going to be a very good unit to utilise because they're not overly expensive, They're very defensively rigid because of that shield. The armor value is not the highest in relation to other factions, and that's kind of a theme with KHAND. They make up for, having maybe a slightly below, in terms of comparison to the Western Kingdoms, a slightly below par armor score, but they have other ways that they make up for that, and the shield value across many of their better units is one such method. Defensive skill relatively low, again armor, but yeah, a pretty efficient unit in the right sort of circumstance, and again a very similar situation when it comes to the Nurad halberds. The same cost here, and again the stats on polearm units in general do tend to be a little bit, it's hard to really judge how much you can really take from them, but the main thing to take away from the halberds is they don't have the range of pikes, but they have that armor piercing, which is nice. Again, bonus fighting cavalry, but that's not surprising from this kind of unit. That phalanx is important though, because one thing that you don't want to be caught out as KHAND is if you get outfought in terms of quality. This is one of the main units that you can use to try and make sure that that doesn't happen. Yeah, the attack of 6. Again, the armor is still the same at 7, which is not terrible for a unit like this, of course, but the fact they don't have a shield does mean that you do want to keep them with the footmen, generally speaking. Otherwise, they will be one of the main targets for enemy missile units. But yeah, pretty much your quintessential basic halberd unit. This, again, maybe slightly worse than the equivalent runic one, but also slightly cheaper, which does mean you're going to have a little bit more funds to play with in terms of fielding your cavalry, or perhaps fielding some of your better units of infantry, starting off with the Brotherhood units, which are kind of the in-between between your basic units and your bodyguard. Starting off with the Brotherhood of the Shadows. We've spoken about how assassin class units are kind of tricky to utilise to their fullest before, and the Brotherhood of the Shadows are no different in that regard. Their stats in some regards are very, very high. You've got the melee attack of 18, big defensive skill as well, as you often see from these kinds of units. Armor score not terrible either, and there are some assassin units with lower armor than this, but still very much reliant on the ability to hide anywhere, because they will be one of the units which enemy archers will want to try and deal with because of their high potential damage. And then the missile attack of 10, close range throwing projectiles, can be really devastating if they go unnoticed, but that can be easier said than done to achieve. 850, again, it really does depend on whether they get singled out or not, as to whether they're going to be worth your time or not. Also, they frighten nearby enemy infantry, which is nice. So if you do get those throwing projectiles off and then get into the backs of enemy units, you can route formations quite nicely. But again, high risk, high reward units, assassins and the Brotherhood of the Shadows, very much in line with what we've seen before in that regard. Something a little bit more commonplace that we will see, however, are the Brotherhood of the Spear, one of the 2 units of infantry which were not in the last KHANDish faction overview. The Brotherhood of the Spear are, of course, a heavily defensive higher-end infantry unit, and much in the same way as the Nurad footmen, you can see that they have a very big shield value. Shield value of 12 is very large. You have to really go into great shield infantry before you start to get higher values than that, so very tough to wear down from the front. The armor value of 8 is honestly not bad either. Decent defensive skills, so obviously the total defense very high. 850 is not an overly expensive outlay either, but in terms of offense, an attack of 8 with the Spear Malice for a unit like this means that they're not going to be dealing damage at pace to infantry units all that efficiently. But that's kind of to be expected. They are very much a through and through defensive kind of a unit, obviously a mainstay when you're trying to dig in as KHAND, and you can't rely on that mobility that they have elsewhere. Obviously they've got that bonus fighting cavalry as well, and inspire nearby troops, which is all good. And then the melee offering of the Brotherhood units, which is far more offense focused, going to be the Brotherhood of the Axe. For the same cost, you get pretty much the blunt opposite to what the Brotherhood of the Spear are in terms of massive attack, charge bonus, effectiveness against armor. They still inspire nearby troops, so you can keep that momentum going as you move forward, but the lack of a shield and the fact that the armor score, when you have an armor score of 8 but it's without a shield, enemy archers are still going to be focusing you down, and the Brotherhood of the Axe definitely going to be one such unit that enemies are going to want to try and deal with as quickly as possible. 850 for a unit of this size is quite a lot if you misuse them as well, but that's not really beyond the pale for a unit of heavy axemen like this. It very often shakes out that way. But when it comes to the infantry units that KHAND have at their highest level, one of the most difficult units to deal with in certain situations that the game has to offer are the Nurad Stormguard. Again, they've got that long weaponry. They don't have the formation, but they also have far higher stats to make up for that. They're kind of similar in many ways to what you would imagine the Fountain Guard to be if they had that second hit point, because of course the Narad Stormguard in terms of forces on foot are where you'll generally find the Khandish Bodyguard, or the Khandish General I should say. Inspiration and Fear, as with many a good bodyguard unit as well. The effectiveness against armour from those long weapons. Again, big stats, attack of 19, more of a shock infantry unit perhaps, but they do wield their halberds a little bit more like you would expect a phalanx unit to, only without the formation. That second hit point, slight shield value, but not too significant. The total defense mainly comes from that defensive skill. Costs 1300. Yeah, just in general, if you need to dig in as KHAND, this is going to be by far and away your best option. But also when it comes to advancing and trying to finish the enemy off, when it comes down to an infantry scrap at the end, especially when, you know, armies are generally tired and a little bit depleted, this can be a very tough unit to break down. So a little bit of a hidden bonus for KHAND if you're not prepared for it. And then we also have the Blood Trolls of KHAND. Now again, the stats very, very high of course, but the way to think of them is, you know, the clue is in the name really. Very, very similar to what you'd expect from the Orcish factions and their trolls, or the Entwives for example. Very much that small but very, very damaging over a short period of time unit of monstrous infantry. 1400 is a lot of money, but one thing to remember is the fact that trolls' main weakness tends to be being charged by cavalry on the open field, but KHAND have got such a focus on trying to really control the cavalry game that you should be able to keep them safe in that regard. So it does eliminate one of the main problems that this kind of unit can run into, and that is worth bearing in mind when you bring them. And of course in a siege, this kind of unit, whether attacking or defending, can really help break up an engagement, but of course they don't last forever. You know, hit points of 8 does mean that they will stay standing for quite a while when you consider, you know, these stats. Obviously big damage also, but you know, pretty much the same sort of thing you can expect from these guys as the other trolls, just it will differ slightly depending on which one you're using as to how long they will last and how quickly they will deal that damage, but that's something for another time. They do have a selection of units on foot that use skirmishers as well, starting with the Nomadic Marauders, a unit of basic javelins, which again, this is the sort of unit which many of the evil factions can utilise to good effect, especially in a siege, because 500 is not a huge outlay for a unit that can be really, really annoying for defenders to try and deal with efficiently. Although you would say that enemy archers can cut them down very fast because the armour score is only 2 and they have no shield, so as much as they may be a cheap unit, they will fall very quickly to enemy fortifications. The missile attack of 5 is fairly standard fare for a unit of entry level javelins as well. And yeah, the effectiveness against armour with those projectiles is key. So yeah, not too different really to the sort of things that we've seen before. And of course the javelins can also help control an open field as well, especially when it comes to trying to ward cavalry off from hitting those soft spots. So it's another one of those situations where KHAND can make enemy cavalry's life a little bit more difficult when they're close to their infantry. The basic unit, which the models used to be the other way around, the nomadic archers here now have got that sort of purple hue, which puts them kind of more into line with the Nurads, but they're actually the entry level archers KHAND, so it is worth bearing that in mind. And you can see their melee stats are pretty poor, as you would expect from an entry level evil archer, with, you know, only 3 attack. The defensive ability as well, the armour, despite looking pretty thick and actually in line with the Nurads, is far lower at 3. So this is probably one of the more misleading units in the game at the moment as a result of that. If they had the brown colour scheme of the nomadic axemen still, it would be a little bit easier to tell, I think. Defensive skill very low also, very low shield value. So yeah, they're a numbers focused archer, but this is the sort of thing that KHAND, especially when we look at their slightly better unit of archers, really do prioritise. It's sort of engaging the enemy with a unit of archers which is purely based on efficiency and trading with the enemy and trying to get the most out of it from a cost efficiency standpoint. And their damaging skirmishers, their truly damaging skirmishers, are going to be the ones that you find on horseback, which we'll talk about in just a moment. But the slightly more efficient archer doing this thing, which is going to be very similar to the nomadic archers, the Variag bowmen, they're just better in every way, a little bit better in melee, not too much, but it's going to be the defensive abilities where they really do come into their own, both here with their baseline model, but especially when you upgrade the armour over here. I think you're going to get a lot of mileage out of this armour upgrade as well. Brings the armour up to 7, they've got that shield value of 3 with those bucklers, which is not amazing, but it's still better than nothing when you combine it with the defensive skill also. Bonus fighting cavalry, which is also nice because obviously archers are going to be one of the main targets of cavalry in general, so any bit of extra damage they can do may dissuade your opponent from going in there in the first place, or if they do, you will at least deal a little bit more in terms of damage. But they're kind of a no-frills, heavy, you know, skirmishing archer really. They'll do the job decently enough. There are of course many forces which will have something superior to this, but it can make life difficult, and in many ways that's what KHAND's foot archer force is all about. But let's move on now to the cavalry and artillery, which is a little bit more of a focus, I'm sure you'll agree, for KHAND. So I suppose the initial feeling here might be that it's a little bit less than you were expecting, but you have to bear in mind that this is still a lot of individual units which you can then mass up to greater effect on the open field, and ultimately this is where we'll start to get into some of the meat and bones of what KHAND are going to be trying to do if they are able to, based on the map and the opponents that they're up against. Starting off with the basic unit, the Wind Riders of KHAND, and this is a very numerous cavalry unit. There are a few cav units in the game which are going to get over the 100 mark in terms of the fighting men that are a part of it. 600 as well, not too expensive. Obviously, in terms of other cavalry units, the stats, the attack of 10 is actually very good, and that's really the main strength. The attack, combined with the fact they have a bonus fighting cavalry because they're melee cav, this is going to be one of the many tools that KHAND have at their disposal to really try and dominate the cav game, because as much as they will lose out to, of course, stronger units of really high-end cav, the numbers and the efficiency of the engagement, especially if they're riding alongside a bodyguard of their own, that can be a real problem for the enemy. And this is where you're going to see the Wind Riders utilised. I don't think you'll be seeing them on many siege battles, to be honest. I think this is pretty much going to be exclusive to really open maps, such as the Grassy Plain, in fact, because you can move them around a little bit more. And one weakness they do have, which is true of many a light cavalry unit, of course, is the fact that enemy archers, both mounted and on foot, can be a bit of a problem for them because they've got no shield, and the armour of 4 is pretty low as well. But good defensive skill. If you can get them into melee with other cavalry units, you're going to be doing very well with them. And then there's a bit of a jump up because you immediately go into the Brotherhood units, of which we saw some of them on foot previously. 900 for a unit of Brotherhood of the Lance, and they fall into the category which we've seen a couple of units of this example before in some of the previous faction overviews, where it's a non-bodyguard unit with the full charge bonus of 20, which is generally reserved for bodyguard units with lancers, but a few units do get it when they're just a little bit below that. The Brotherhood of the Lance are one of them, and pretty much all of them are glass cannon kind of cavalry units, where the defensive abilities, the defensive skill of the Brotherhood of the Lance is actually very good, so it does allow them to escape with enemy cavalry engagements with a little bit more efficiency than they otherwise would. But other than that, no shield, and also the fact they don't have a bonus against enemy cavalry. But they do cause fear, and that big charge bonus means if you do land it, it can be utterly devastating in the same way as the units we've talked about previously, what Tharbad Riders being one good example of that. But again, the armour of 8 is also very much in line with the kind that these units on foot had. 900 is quite expensive as well, but that's kind of the price you pay for having a cav-heavy army, as we already mentioned. I mean, KHAND's infantry is not too expensive, so you can play a bit of unit Tetris if you want this kind of unit involved, but it is a risk, of course. Losing a unit worth 900 to not a lot is a bit of a hole that you then have to dig yourself out of. So again, a bit of a risk-reward unit this, which KHAND, we've already mentioned, do have a few of. And then the bodyguard cavalry, which is where you're really going to be trying to domineer your opponent, starting off with the melee variant, the Nurad Windblades. 1,150 is not all that much in terms of an initial outlay for a unit of this quality, especially when you consider that in melee terms there's going to be few units that are going to be able to withstand them, because they've got that attack of 20, bonus fighting cavalry, big damage of course. The main weakness they have, I mean, defensive skill of 25 as well, because they're a dual-wielding cavalry unit, is a real rarity as well. So 1-to-1 against enemy cav, they are going to get the better of them most times, but support from enemy units nearby, the lower armour, that's going to be where maybe the Nurad Windblades do fall down. They cover the ground very quickly though, and generally speaking, I think, considering the function they're supposed to have, their strengths do outshine their weaknesses in that regard. So I think it is actually a good price, 1,150, and considering the fact that you're going to want to bring a cav heavy force if you can, the fact that KHAND can field it a little bit more easily does make a good deal of sense. So yeah, those curved blades are going to be very, very good, and they'll give any cavalry unit they come up against a real fight, and the vast majority of times they will win that fight. But if you do need something maybe a little bit more orthodox in relation to some of the other cavalry units that we've seen from the Western Kingdoms, then the Variag Cataphracts are going to be the way to go. Very heavy cavalry unit, of course, with big armour value of 11. Good defensive skill also. The shield value is not the most in comparison to some others, but it will still get the job done, especially when you're meant to keep this kind of unit, even though they are a little bit more tanky moving anyway. A little bit more slower moving, as you would expect, considering the very heavy armour. Again, the full charge bonus of 20. Inspiration and fear, obviously the fear being more significant for cav, as we've mentioned in the past. And they still have that bonus fighting cavalry as well, because they are the full lance knights, but as a result of that, 1500 is the cost. I mean, they are very much in line with what you would expect from this kind of unit from other factions, so there's nothing too surprising there. I don't know, again, we'd have to look in greater detail which of these is going to be the best stats-wise, but they will still do the same job regardless. And the fact they've got such a heavy cavalry force around them as well makes their job arguably a little bit easier than the vast majority of units that we've spoken about previously of this type. And then moving on to the horse archers, obviously a very significant part of the Khandish roster, as it was for the Rohirrim. Here we have the Variag horse archers, which are pretty much the same thing on horseback as they are on foot. 650, which is not all that much more than the footbound variant, albeit they are a smaller unit. And of course you have the same option to upgrade the armour as well. That is a significant thing as well, purely because horse archers like this, even though they do have that buckler and the armour upgrade, foot archers are still going to be a bit of a problem because of the volume of fire using them. It does take a little bit of finesse and know-how in general, horse archers, but as a harassment unit this is going to be a very good one. 650 for this type of unit as well is not all that much. The one problem that you will have with this is they don't have a bonus against cavalry, and their melee attack is pretty pitiful. So if they don't have a unit of melee cav or any cav nearby to help support them, they could be in trouble against enemy cav units, so that is worth bearing in mind. As much as they are a little bit better perhaps against horse archers' traditional weaknesses, they are a little bit weaker against enemy cav. One of the only examples of such a thing that you'll find in the Khandish roster, really. But trying to safeguard your horse archers is a big part of playing as KHAND. And then for a little bit more damage, a little bit more quality as well, you have the Brotherhood of the Bow, the second to last Brotherhood unit that we'll be speaking about. Big part of their roster, all of them with that sort of samurai aesthetic with their helms and the blackened armour. 800 is a lot for a unit which is relatively fragile, but they do have that missile attack of 8, which is pretty good. I mean, that's the sort of value that you would expect from an elven heavy archer on foot in some cases. So it's a big amount of damage, but admittedly there's only 53, so again you do have to look after them. A little bit micro intensive, but that's true of the Brotherhood units outside of the Brotherhood of the Spear, really, just in general. They are all very damaging other than that unit, but they do require a little bit of babying perhaps, and they have that bonus fighting cavalry, which is significant. It means that they can defend themselves a little bit more easily than the Variags just in front of them, but you still want to keep them close by to some units which are a little bit more well suited for that sort of thing, at least early in battles. And then another bodyguard unit over here. KHAND are not short on bodyguard options. The Chieftain's Vanguard is probably one of the safer places you can put them because, of course, you've got that mobility, but you also are trying to keep this unit at range, at least initially, because of their missile attack. Again, same missile attack of 8, but they're a far tankier unit, it must be said, with a melee attack of 14. They've got a bonus fighting cav as well, so they're going to be no slouches. And in terms of the total defense as well, decent armor of 10, well, very decent armor of 10. Really good defensive skill, second hit point, 1200, and really it's down to them, really, or the Galathran Riders of Lothlorien, as for who is the best horse archer in the game. The Chieftain's Vanguard, maybe a little bit tanky, a little bit more conservative and defensive, whereas the Galathran Riders, Silverthorn Arrows, a little bit more offensively gifted, perhaps, and that does give them maybe a slight edge in many people's mind, but don't discount the Vanguard in that comparison. Really, really good at keeping your generals safe as well, which for KHAND is important because, of course, as we mentioned, morale can be a bit of an issue for them potentially. So if you have them in a unit like this, it means that they're a little bit easier to safeguard throughout the battle. And then finally, we have a chariot unit, the Brotherhood of the Wain, which are my personal favourite chariot units in the game. All of them now have decent numbers as a general rule, so it really just comes down to what missile you've got on the back. Again, the archers of Rune are not really my favourite. The javelins as well of the elves, it's good punch up close, but generally speaking by that point you're in and committed. The crossbows give you that nice middle ground, really, and each individual shot is still very, very potent indeed, causing fear as they rampage through the lines, which is nice, but they have the same issues really as all chariots, which is if they stop, they die off very quickly. 3 hit points may seem like a lot, but not for a unit of this size and hitbox and the amount of damage it takes very quickly. Very much something that you need to micro, and if you do, it can be a really, really potent tool. If you don't, it can be 1300 gold down the drain very, very fast, and it's one of those units where it's hard to gauge the stats once again. And finally, an artillery piece, which is kind of a unique one. The crew itself are a rather interesting one. They've got a unique crew. They've got those large falxes and the purple armour as well. But The Hwacha is really good at dealing with wide formations on open field, kind of again the opposite to what many artillery units can be. They're also really good at countering enemy artillery, because generally speaking at least some of those rockets are going to hit the enemy artillery pieces, and that can end up crumbling them very, very fast. But they don't have the individual spot burst damage that something like a catapult or a trebuchet has, which can be super useful in a siege especially. The Hwacha isn't really decent at doing that, but it's good at its own thing, and it's a real puzzle to work out if you find yourself on the receiving end of it and you don't have sort of a natural go-to. If your idea was to try and sit back and absorb the movement pressure that KHAND were going to put on you, but then they've also got the Hwacha, it can mean that you have to then move. Otherwise, you know, you're going to end up just slowly hemorrhaging out as a result of the damage from this thing, and then the cavalry can get you, and then all of a sudden, you know, the KHANDish game plan can start to take shape. It's an interesting one. It's not completely unique because the Shire do have pretty much their own variant, which is a clone really in terms of its functionality, but still something which, when it does get brought onto the open field, it can be a real menace. Not so much on a defensive siege, but in an offensive siege, depending on how much cover you have as well, it can be a real problem. So there we have it, KHAND. It's been a little bit of a break since the last faction overview we did, and we return here to the men of the furthest reaches east of Middle-earth. And next we will be sort of finishing up really. There's only 3 more factions after this one, so we may as well start heading our way back westward, starting off with another Evil Men faction, albeit this one with a far clearer history and lineage, you would say, and the modern day Numenorians, the Black Numenorians of Umbar, are who we will be dealing with next. So I hope you enjoyed this, and hope you'll join me for that.